Welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Gareth, hello, and with me as always is Alan.
Hello.
Hello, Alan. And today we're talking about one of the early sitcoms, one of the first generation of British sitcoms, the rag trade from the early 1960s. So, Alan, this is obviously, we often joke about how I'm an old man, but this is before even my time. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about the time of when this came out and, how original was it?
Well, yeah, so the rag trade first started in 1961. Had its original incarnation, ran for 3 series from 61 to 63. So that's really early in terms of television sitcom. It's pre-Steptoe. It's about the same time as Hancock was going out.
Yeah.
Which are these really kind of classic early BBC things.
Well, when we did the Steptoe episode, we talked about Hancock and kind of had a bit of debate as to whether it classes as a sitcom because the characters change a little bit. And we also, Steptoe and Son, of course, was one of these comedy playhouses that when it started, it was just a one-off TV play. And obviously they had those sorts of things. But were there any other sitcom series that were episodic like this?
There were things going on at the time, like the Army Game, for example, but this was the early days, and it was derived from radio. There was sitcom on radio already, but again, not quite the same. And it was these early years where the language of sitcom was being written. We've talked about Steptoe and Son before. That was the show that really laid down kind of what sitcom was going to be, and obviously that's changed over the years. But the rag trade, I think, has probably more in common with your regular sitcoms nowadays, or certainly your classic sitcoms of, say, 70s to the 90s, because it is much more of an ensemble cast, a lot of characters there to play with, and it's knockabout fun, really. It's not trying to do what Steptoe does, which is inject a bit of drama into things. It doesn't really do that.
Well, I don't want to tip my hand too much, but I agree with you. I'm going to tip my hand completely. I really enjoyed this. I'd never seen it before. I'd sort of heard of it, but nothing more than that. I didn't know anything about it before we started watching episodes. This is 60 years old, and it just seemed quite fresh. They're obviously the scenario is we're in a sewing machinist's factory, and the setup is we've got all these women, or all these girls, as they are called within the lingo of the time, who are the workforce. We've got the owner, Peter Jones, and we've got Reg Varney playing the sort of shop floor supervisor. And it's a kind of us against the boss type of setup. So it was, it's kind of a little bit of its time in the sense that there's a union and there's a lot of comedy that derives from that. But aside from that, it felt like it could have been made today in the sense that it was, like you say, an ensemble cast, relatively timeless humour and jokes. It was just a group of people being funny together.
Well, what I found interesting, really, is sort of thinking of early sitcom. Where did this come from and all that sort of thing? Because this doesn't derive from a radio show or anything like that. This is an original concept. And although I have heard reference to it being not exactly inspired by, but certainly influenced by a film called I'm All Right, Jack, which you may have heard of as a classic comedy of the late 50s, I think, maybe early 60s. And that's about trade unions. But that seems to be the starting point here. We've got trade unions. That's a big thing right now. So we've got that, and the boss has to go against them. The fact that they made them all women, it's unexpected, I guess. It wouldn't be the obvious choice.
Perhaps it's unnecessary insofar as if they wanted to make a comedy about, the bosses versus the unions, then they could have all been blokes. That's not... The fact that they're women is not necessary to tick that box, if you see what I mean.
Yes. It's not fundamental to the story, yes. Although I wonder if there was some reasoning behind that. Like, if we make a show about men being in a trade union and bullying the boss, is that less funny than if it's women? Or is that less sympathetic somehow? I don't know. But the fact that, not only has most of the principal characters women, they are strong women who domineer the men in the show. Absolutely. Even though they are not in the position of power in the sense of the job or how much they're getting paid and that sort of thing. They are in charge of the situation.
The basic dynamic is that, Mr. Fenner, who owns the factory, it's every episode seems to start with him getting an order. So he's on the phone and someone wants to buy some stuff. Yes, my girls will be able to do that, no problem. Then he goes out to tell the
best
girls.
Workforce you could ever find.
Then he goes out to tell the girls what he wants them to do, and they start negotiating a rate, and they bully him, and they take all the profit out of it for him, and then hilarity ensues, things go wrong, and that's where the comedy springs from.
You say this seems to happen every episode. It happens every episode. It's very formulaic, this show. And watching them all in one kind of big go, which is obviously what I did, it does get pretty repetitive. But I would frame this show as fun rather than funny. The gags are pretty obvious and straight down the line, but it's fun and it's just entertaining. There's quite a lot of slapstick in the early series, and I think it is a show that is raised above the writing by performance. I think this is very much an example of getting casting right, not necessarily in every single case, but as we'll come on to the characters.
Well, we'll talk about the actors as we usually do. We'll go through the actors as we go along. But I agree with you. I think the cast are really good. Just for the benefit of our listeners, we watched. Obviously, you watched all of them as you do. I watched a few episodes. The one that we're going to focus on is from the first series in 1961, right?
That's right.
And it's episode 4, which is called French Fashions.
And just to jump in there, if you buy this on the DVD, the first series episodes are just apparently in a completely random, arbitrary order. So when we say series 1, episode 4, that is based on the broadcast dates.
Oh, well, now that's interesting, Alan, because I was going to go on to ask you about how easy it is to get a hold of these episodes, because I think I read that some of these episodes have gone forever.
That's correct, yes, as we see so often with these early shows, the BBC's slightly bizarre policy of deleting their back catalogue of work. So this first incarnation of the show, which is the BBC version, has all the existing episodes that they're aware of at the moment. 8 episodes from the 10 of the first series, which are some are of worse quality than others, because depending on where they found them, And then series 2 has 11 of 13 episodes, I believe it is. And then series 3, they have no episodes surviving, although I have read somewhere that one was found a few years ago somewhere, so possibly that'll be available in the future. And I'll come on to that a little bit later, because series 3 did have some changes, and obviously I can't really comment on them too much. And then just to set up, we'll talk about this a bit later, but there was a reboot of this show, really, a second incarnation of it in the 70s, made by LWT for ITV. And we'll talk about that as well later on as a kind of legacy element. But I am probably going to be comparing one to the other just because it makes an easy comparison. So I might mention that at some point.
So this episode then,
yeah,
French Fashions. We start off, as I just said, in the same way that we do every week, with an order coming in for Mr. Fenner. And this time it's for some French workmanship. So it's an American guy who wants to get some specific garments that can only be produced by French workmanship. And so the basic scenario, the setup for this episode is that the girls have got to pretend to be French.
Yes.
That's where our humour is derived.
Although actually that only kicks in about halfway through after they've failed the first sort of deal attempt.
True.
And that is something I noticed about these earlier episodes, is they do pack a lot of stuff in. Because, that could be an opening. Oh, God, we got to pretend to be French. Go. Like, that could be the starting point. But that's the second half, really.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we get into the plot of this, why don't let me start talking about some of the cast and characters. So we said Mr. Fenner, he's the guy who owns Fenner Fashions. So he's played by Peter Jones. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Peter Jones?
Well, just to start with the character, if we dare we start on a negative here, I think Peter Jones is the weak link of this cast. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think he's a weak character in the sense that they sort of walk all over him. But but I think that's all right. That's deliberate.
No, that's okay. But what I mean really from an acting point of view, I think what Peter Jones brings to this is very one-dimensional, and he does everything at the same level. And I don't think it's for want of trying. I think the writing is there, and he's trying to do things, and it's just not. It doesn't sell, particularly when he's surrounded by like what I was saying is a really strong cast.
I mean, look at these house coats. Look at that lot. I don't know what's happened to you and those girls, Reg.
Wow, people take it easy round about Christmas time.
That's fair enough, but my girls start taking it easy for Christmas time round about August bank holiday. And they're still celebrating New Year's Eve at Whitsun. That leaves 2 weeks in July when they should be working at full pressure. And that's when they choose to have their summer holidays.
So, I don't want to start on the negative, but that feels like the weak link for me anyway.
Okay. Well, Peter Jones, to me, before we started watching this, Peter Jones is the voice of the book in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes,
I'm a nerd,
yes.
so, that's where I would know his name from. But I didn't really know him other than that. So what had he done before this?
Well, he was fairly standard, just sort of rep theatre and done... He worked in radio in the 50s and done quite a lot of comedy on there. And he seemed to get a good reputation for just general off-the-cuff wit and being a personality. He could go on the panel shows and do that. Yeah, he did a show. He did a kind of semi-improv comedy thing with Peter Ustinov.
Well, when I say the word raconteur, the image that comes into my head is Peter Ustinov.
Exactly. So, yeah, he was just a sort of jobbing actor / comedy personality. And I don't know if he had a particularly sterling reputation, but the Rag Trade was his best known TV role. Like this one kind of made him a much more household name. And just to qualify, the Rag Trade was a big hit at the time, a really big hit, and it made these guys all household names, which they were not before. These guys were not established stars previously. Yeah, I think he's probably best remembered now as the book out of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, just because that is such a sort of cult fan following that has. Well, yeah,
it's probably best remembered by people, nerds like you and me, and probably our listeners. Sorry.
I'll talk a bit about what he kind of did later. We'll come back to that later, but yeah, that's kind of the setup for Peter Jones, and it's going to be very similar for all of these guys. They were working actors who became household names off the back of this show.
Yeah, some big names in this. What about the character then? What about Mr. Fenner?
Yeah, he's a weak character in the sense that you mentioned there, that he does get walked all over. And that's ultimately frustrating, I think, when you watch 20 episodes in a row. But it is important. Obviously, it's a crucial aspect to how Paddy, the shop steward, is able to domineer him. And then there's just these very classic comedy tropes where he's, the wife's always shouting at him on the phone. The mother-in-law turns up and berates him. The mother-in-law turns up while, Carol is getting changed in his office and she sees a semi-naked woman in there and obviously draws her own conclusions. It's hilarious. But that is farce, really. And let's be clear, this is a farce. This is slapstick and farce. Fenner kind of has to be like that. What is interesting in the later series, the 70s series, they do play around with him a little bit more, and I see something a little bit more from him that it would have been nice to have got earlier, which is like he'll fight back a little bit sometimes, and he'll get angry and shout a little bit.
Well, I think that might be... See, one of the things that we'll probably talk about later is how this plays on this idea of industrial relations, the bosses versus the workers. Mm-hmm. And, well, frankly, between 1961 and 1975, that relationship had changed.
Yeah.
There was a different dynamic there, and I guess the comedy came from a different place as well.
Yeah, but that's also what I was saying regarding the fact that we have the female characters here in charge. Does that matter? Is that important? If you have a very vociferous, angry manager coming and shouting at them all the time, does that create a different dynamic? Not as fun. Or if you have male workers who are striking or taking action, is that less sympathetic somehow? Is that, or
perhaps?
Because it's women, you feel like you feel better that they're standing up and fighting against the oppression, whereas the male workers, it just looks like bullying, which is a fine line actually in this show in general. I think the way that Paddy behaves towards Fenner is a very fine line that goes too far sometimes.
Yeah, well, that's it's a really interesting relationship, isn't it? But, again, they're the two that personify this class struggle. And, that was a class struggle that was probably playing out to some extent in everyone's in the lives of the people watching. And so, a fine line has to be walked and there has to be a balance struck and both sides have to claim the occasional victory.
Yes, which they do, yes. As much as it is a very formulaic show, you will occasionally get Fenner getting the upper hand. But it's all very pleasant, ultimately, I think.
Yeah.
And it is, obviously, it's the class struggle, isn't it? I mean, it's your classic British ingredients for comedy. Well, for anything, really. Shall we talk about Paddy, then?
So we've mentioned Paddy a few times. Paddy is the shop steward, played by Miriam Karlin, and she's the antagonist to Fenner. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a great character. Miriam Karlin, I will be honest with you, I'd not really heard of her before this. Mm-hmm. I think she's brilliant. I think she's great. I think she does a really good job of this character.
Now, I want to establish a really high bonus rate for this dress. Now, what's difficult about it?
Nothing really.
Belt up, darling. Do you second that?
Carried, belt up.
Right. Now, how long would it take a really conscientious worker to make this dress?
6 hours.
Yeah, how long would it take us?
Couple of days.
Right, couple of days. Mr. Fenner, my brothers have decided the dress takes 2 days to make.
Yeah, she's one of those actors who is probably a bit better known for stage work and all that sort of thing. And definitely this was her best known thing, not just at the time, but I think, if you're looking back on her career, this is kind of the headline role that she'll be remembered for. She is, of course, in A Clockwork Orange, quite famously, a famous bit in that where she gets assaulted with a phallus statue. So, that's something to be remembered for.
I actually remember her in, because obviously I looked her up after watching this, and she was in a 90s sitcom called So Haunt Me, which also starred George Costigan and Tessa Pete Jones. And I remember that. I couldn't have told you it was Miriam Karlin playing the old Jewish lady who haunted the family home.
Young people, they don't scare like they used to. It's all this video. At my age, I should compete with Hollywood.
I'm going to scream, then you'll disappear. You're just a figment of my imagination.
Such long words she uses.
I remember the sitcom. I won't say that I loved it, but I do remember watching it.
You say it's a hell of a setup. I mean, you just did it in one sentence. An old Jewish woman haunts a family home. Yeah, it's an odd show. I did watch a little bit of it actually, just because I wasn't particularly familiar with it. And that's basically the only other sitcom she's done as a proper kind of regular role. She was obviously a bit older by then. I don't know how they managed to get 3 series out of it. It didn't feel like a concept that
I'm fairly convinced I didn't watch every episode. I might have watched 1 or 2.
But yeah, so Miriam Karlin herself, she's actually a little bit more middle class than you might think based on this role. Her father was a barrister, but then her father was also a champion of trade union law and stuff like this. So, and she herself was made an OBE for her union work with Equity. She was she did a lot of work with Equity. So, there's obviously parallels there, but she wasn't particularly working class. She went to RADA and she performed with ENSA during the war, which is something we've seen quite a lot as we've been looking back at these older shows. Like Leonard Pierce in Only Fools and Horses, for example, he was part of ENSA during the war.
ENSA was the sort of entertainment division of the army during the Second World War. So they would go around and entertain the troops. So they were actually conscripted. They were serving military officers. But their assignment during the war was to go and sing songs and do dances and put on plays for the bored troops, which I suppose beats being in a trench.
It does, and actually a really important part of morale and keeping everyone going and everything. It's a worthwhile thing.
It really is. The only problem is that because we're sitcom historians, I just think of It Ain't Half Hot Mum, and I can't sort of get past that. And I just imagine Melvin Hayes dressed up singing in drag, and I assume that's what Leonard Pierce was doing during the war.
There's definitely a difference. In It Ain't Half Hot Mum, they're a concert party. It's not quite the same thing. I'm not sure if there's any military experts out there might know the difference, but it's definitely not quite the same thing. So that's Miriam Karlin, and she is a vital ingredient here. Yeah. But I think, for my money, what really lifts this show above falls on the other principal cast members. So I would say Sheila Hancock, Esma Cannon and Reg Varney. And I'd say about 80% of that is Esma Cannon for me. There's something about her.
Well, I'm really surprised, because we're going to disagree on this, because we'll talk a bit more about the character, but Esma Cannon's character really wound me up. I did not enjoy her at all. Tell us a bit about Esme Cannon and the character she plays. She's one of the workers.
Yeah, so one of the workers, Esme Cannon plays Lil, who is the oldest worker there by quite a considerable amount. They are all young women.
But they're unmarried, Alan. That's the point. You know, when you got married, you stopped working. You had your kids.
Yeah, exactly. Although one of them, but yeah, basically in the very first episode, you know, one of the girls, her husband turns up with a baby,
that's right,
saying, "I'm not looking after this. You can take care of it."
Yeah.
So mostly unmarried. Yeah, but so Lily is a spinster. Looks like she's probably about 60. Played by Esme Cannon, and like. Esme Cannon's about 4'7" or something ridiculous.
The physicality's amazing. She's this tiny little bird she's like a skeletal bird of a woman.
Yes, and it works fantastically. Like her physical, what she brings to it, what she does, just the way she will walk into a room can really create something funny.
Oh, Doctor, I'm so glad you're here. It's me twinges.
Oh, tell me where it hurts.
Across the back. Oh. Oh, you found it.
This is what we call a rheumatic pain. Now it's there, isn't it?
Yes, just below the label on me vest.
And that's what I mean. I think there's just a tone that she brings that I really like. I will acknowledge that she basically just has one thing that she does, and it's kind of like flapping about and going,
kooky, flappy, reacting to things. Yeah, but she's a bit of a caricature in a show that I think is grounded in reality quite well. She's a real caricature, and just that's why she jarred with me a little bit.
Well, I think for whatever reason, I do acknowledge what you're saying there, but for whatever reason, for me, it worked, and it just kind of it injected that little bit of ridiculousn's into the situation.
So what's Esme Cannon's backstory then? She must be the oldest person in the cast.
Yeah, she's Australian actually, born and bred in Australia, and worked as a child actor.
A child actor now. I'm genuinely not trying to be rude here, but does that mean pre-talkies?
yeah, pretty much.
Silent movies.
On stage and theatre stuff as well. 1905 she was born.
Wow, yeah.
She played child roles quite well into her adulthood just because she was so small and everything. And just moved to London to kind of like, there's work there. And became a character actor, got plenty of work. But, just because of what she does and how she looks, she's never going to be playing leads or anything. Yeah, she's probably best known she's best known for Ragtrade. She also appeared in a few Carry On films. She's quite well remembered for those roles.
Do you know what? She seems very, I'm not really sure how I can quantify this, but she seems very music hall. She seems like she would have been a good act at a music hall in the 1890s or something like that. She's very old-fashioned in that sense.
Yeah, I can just imagine someone pushing on a pram, like an oversized pram, and then she jumps out as dressed as a baby.
Yeah, sings a song, Some jokes. That's perfect.
But I think that's perhaps why I like it and why it works for me, because this really feels like it's come from the music hall, and I think the Ragtrade owes a lot to that. So in one episode, for example, it's the first episode, Reg, they need to warm up the baby's milk. They've got a baby there, and so he puts the baby bottle on the steam press.
That's right.
Accidentally leaves it there for too long, it gets pressed down, and when he goes to get it, what he reveals is like a giant piece of cardboard milk bottle squashed shape.
Yeah, that was very cartoony, wasn't it? I saw that. I mean, I'll be truthful, it made me laugh because it was unexpected. But yeah, that was, I just said a minute ago, this is grounded in reality. That was very much it wasn't.
But that, I think, is very telling of the time. Not just because it was so early. It's kind of still early for TV, really. And what are we doing here?
That's a visual joke. That's a joke that would work on stage.
It's a joke. It's like, we need to make sure that the guys at the back of the hall can see this prop.
Yeah, and Reg Varney sort of holds it up, presents it. Exactly. As if to the audience,
And there's a lot of that going on in this when you watch these things, where if you see something from the 70s, for example, you just don't have that. The language has moved on by that point. You don't get that in, for example, Steptoe and Son. Well, that's what I'm talking about. Steptoe and Son feels much more refined and written for TV rather than written for music hall. And one of the writers here specifically started in music hall, writing for comedians, writing for gags on vaudeville and stuff like that. So Ronald Wolfe. So I think it's got that lineage, and it displays it quite proudly in these early episodes, certainly. And I think that's okay. I think it makes it feel a little bit of its time. But the level of humour still works. It's just that the way it's expressed might be slightly different. You just wouldn't have... So, for example, in the 70s remake of this show, they do the same bit. They put the baby bottle in the press. And then when he reveals it, it's a baby bottle that has been squashed as if it's been stamped on, you know? It just looks like a proper squashed baby bottle. But that's not as funny. So the joke they get out of it is that when it's pressed down, the milk spurts out all over Fenner's jacket. So they've had to change the gag just because a giant cardboard milk bottle won't work. Yeah. So let's go back into our episode a little bit, because what we find is that Fenner needs to has some new crease-proofing solution that he wants to put on his trousers. Yes, which again is almost in an Acme bottle with crease-proof written on it. And
he hands it over to Reg with the "Be careful, follow the instructions."
Yeah,
which,
so like,
sort of
definitely don't do anything.
Definitely
wrong.
don't leave the trousers in too long, otherwise all sorts of hilarity could ensue. But then we go back out onto the shop floor, because Reg is going to go and apply this permo crease to the trousers. But as we go back to the shop floor, Paddy is doing Carol's hair because they want to save a bit of money. Carol's going to be modelling these trousers for the American client. And so Fenner's given her some money to go and get her hair done, but they want to trouser that money. And so Paddy's doing her hair for her with a bottle of perm lotion, which looks suspiciously like the permo crease. What could possibly go wrong?
And this is, again, something they do, something you'll see a lot if you watch these things over and again, are repeated gags. They are not afraid to do that. So there's at least 3 episodes where Carol is there doing her hair and something goes wrong.
Really?
There's another repeated gag is a character, different one each time, but a character who has started to roll their own fags because, they're trying to save money. And like, oh no, I'm terrible at rolling fags. Oh, well, I'll light it anyway. And then it just sets fire in like a big flame in their face.
It's interesting. Carol is very much presented as the glamorous face of Fenner Fashions, and she's in this episode. She's modelling these trousers for the American to try and impress him. And there's various references to her being glamorous. And she's played by Sheila Hancock, who's a very beautiful young woman. I looked it up. She's 28 at the time of this being recorded. The thing about her is, and I don't know if it's because of the clothes, the hairstyles, she just looks like someone's nana. She looks like pictures of my granny from the 1960s, which I suppose is about right. But it's funny that in 1961 she was considered glamorous and beautiful, but with our filter 60 years later, she just looks like a sort of frumpy middle-aged lady.
Well, I don't know, because I think there is an element here. I mean, no ill will to Sheila Hancock, but I think there is an element of irony here that she's the model, because the whole point is she's a cut-price model. Fenner isn't going to pay a model.
Right.
He's got a tall, thin girl. That's good enough. The fact that she's got a grandma's face doesn't matter.
I don't know. I think she's presented several times as glamorous, and Fenner says, "Well, I've seen that she's a very beautiful young woman," and so I think, actually, as I say, she is a beautiful woman. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on her. It's just the point I'm making is about the style of the day, which was, she had this modern haircut in 1961, which is before the Beatles. Yeah. Whereas to our modern eyes, it looks like a very old-fashioned haircut.
But I think it's actually an important part of the character that she's not glamorous. Like, she's not stylish. She's a working-class woman who's doing the best. It's like a poor man's version of glamour, It's like, it's all this kind of cut-price versions of things. She hasn't got the latest clothes. She hasn't got the latest hairstyle. She's got what her mum can do or what her friend can do on her hair and all that. Yeah. And I think that's definitely deliberate and, very telling of that time and those people that work at your working classes.
Well, we've mentioned Sheila Hancock now, so why don't we go off on a Sheila Hancock tangent?
Yeah, I mean, weirdly, like Sheila Hancock to me, like, has always seemed like one of the elder stateswomen of acting, like a Maggie Smith or that sort of person, and definitely better known for theatre in my head.
Yeah, I'd say she's borderline national treasure status.
Well, she just became a dame in this
2021
New Year's honours. So, yeah, that's how much more national treasure do you want?
Exactly. Endorsed by her Madge.
But yeah, what could you actually say, Sheila Hancock is in this?
That's a really good question, because I basically went through this same thought process, and I sort of went on IMDb and looked, and there were several things where I was like, oh God, yes, I remember her being in that. Oh yeah. But not actually nothing that oh, she is famous for X. You know, she's just got a long career of many credits.
Yeah, and I think, like, again, like a Maggie Smith or a Judi Dench, she's someone who I associate with being an older woman and kind of playing those characters. But, you know, obviously all these people had careers when they were young as well. And funnily enough with Sheila Hancock, yeah, I think she is better known for stage work, really. So that doesn't quite last as long in the memory. And obviously I haven't seen her do anything on stage. But back in the day, back in the 60s, she was a sitcom star. No doubt about that. She did several things. And I think one of the great things about this show and her performance is she has such a great comedic instinct.
Yeah.
And she's doing loads of physical stuff, but also just the way she delivers lines, it feels so much more natural and kind of, it feels like to me that she's dropping in extra words here and there, like not going off script, but just kind of continuing a line, you know, where you say, oh, I told you that was going to happen. See, I told you. Like, you know, it's like just adding something on just to fill the gaps, fill the spaces. And for example, Peter Jones, I feel like he's saying the lines he's been given and he's not going to deviate from that, except when he gets them wrong.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I was looking through the IMDb list and seeing what I recognised, there was one thing which I didn't recognise from basically the next thing she did afterwards, which was called The Bedsit Girl, which looked like she was the main star of that sitcom with Derek Nimmo. Did you learn anything about that?
Yeah, well, it's lost to time, that one, so you can't see it. But that was written by Ronald Chesney and Ronald Wolfe, who wrote The Rag Trade. It was written for her. And yeah, it was a follow-up to this. It was like, oh, well, she's a big star now. What can we do?
She was the breakout star.
Well, I think they all were, really. They all went on... Well, they didn't all go on to do other things. Esme Cannon pretty much retired after she did this. Sheila Hancock has a really interesting story, actually. She has written at least one autobiography, and she does lots of interviews and things. It's definitely an interesting story to look at. But she had quite a tumultuous childhood, you know, moved around a lot. Her parents ran pubs and stuff, so she moved from one pub to another, and she got evacuated during the war as a child, so like that, obviously very, you know, a tumultuous thing to happen. But got into acting, ended up at RADA and all that, got a grammar school education, even though she was a bit more working class, you know, got a scholarship to RADA and all this. Yeah. And so I think she's always kind of felt like she hasn't quite fitted in, and perhaps that informs the way she performs somehow. But yeah, Rag Trade was her big break, you know, no doubt about that. Made her a household name. And then she did loads of sitcoms. So she did The Bedsit Girl, which was, like I say, written for her by Chesney and Wolfe. And then the
thing that I liked about that was that it was her and Derek Nimmo as a young couple. I just can't imagine Derek Nimmo young.
And then she did a sitcom called Mr. Digby Darling in the late 60s with Peter Jones. So that's Peter Jones is the boss of this company. She's his secretary, but she acts like his wife. Like she does his cleaning and ironing and cooking and stuff, and she treats him like a precious husband. So he has to come to work to get away from, his wife at home. I watched a couple episodes of that. It was an interesting thing. It was a big show at the time. It was a very big success. And with these guys who were still hot from, the likes of the Rag Trade.
Nasty business, this bigamist in Oldham. He married 3 women and they all ended up as left luggage.
Oh, how horrible. I mean, he made his point by getting rid of the first one, but all 3.
Old habits die hard, I suppose.
It's interesting just to see Sheila Hancock play something completely different to the Rag Trade, because she's quite put on a bit more airs and graces. It feels a lot more dated than Rag Trade, even though it was made later. And then another show she did called Now Take My Wife, which wasn't a success as well in the early 70s. And then, she did moved more into theatre, and she's done every theatre role you can imagine, really. Musicals, lead parts, supporting parts as an older woman now, these days. Yeah. Nominated for 6 Olivier Awards, I think it was. And that sort of thing. Just been a top-end working actor for 60 years. Yeah. And still works now, still gigging. She's 88, still knocking about. But also, she seemed to have developed, a Ustinov-esque raconteur status, where she will, even back in the 60s, she was doing panel shows on the radio, like Just a Minute and all that sort of thing. And able to hold her own in what was still very much a man's world, even back then, if not now. You can find a lot of interviews with her and just telling anecdotes and stories. She's just a great storyteller in that. Yeah. And so, for example, one of the things she was talking about in an interview I heard was that when they were doing the Rag Trade, her and Miriam Karlin were both working in theatre at the time. So they were rehearsing for Rag Trade in the day, doing their theatre shows in the evening, and then recording on Sunday on their days off. And so they were just exhausted all the time. And she was saying, like, yeah, we just took Purple Hearts and drank champagne. That's how we got through it. She's very open about like about things she's done in her past.
Like in the 60s.
Yeah, everyone took them. It was fine. And she has got a very nice turn of anecdote about it. It's definitely worth looking up. But yeah, so Sheila Hancock, a real personality and a comedic instinct that comes through in this, and we see it in this episode. You know, she has to really take the brunt of the physical comedy here by modelling trousers that are stiff, basically.
Well, who would have thought it? Reg left the permacrease on too long.
Oh no, I can't believe it. As did Paddy on Carol's hair, so her perm is a bit crap. So they go to this American buyer. She's got to model the trousers. The trousers are extremely stiff. Reg Varney is in a small room with a very conspicuous empty glass vase on the side of a shelf. So obviously he knocks that over at one point. There's a lot of very basic setup and payoff with all this stuff. But it does work. They just about get away with it with a kind of with a good humour and nice performance.
And you have to bear in mind that things that we look back now and we say, oh God, that's so obvious, that vase. You know, maybe it wasn't so obvious then.
Yeah, so we have a whole scene where they get these trousers onto her and she's modelling the trousers. She can't bend her legs. And it's a beautiful bit of physical comedy. You know, she's and there's several examples of this. Like, this is stock in trade. Carol's doing the modelling. Oh no, something's gone wrong with the clothes. So they've shrunk and they're far too small. They've been cut off or something. You know, something's happened.
So she does the modelling quite regularly then.
Yeah. In fact, there's one episode where Linda Barron off of Open All Hours turns up in the as a slightly posh kind of secretary that's working for Fenner, and she wants to do the modelling, and that's the plot of one episode where Carol is being chucked out as a model.
Does that girl really do the modelling?
Yes, I do, because I'm tall and I'm skinny like a model.
Yeah, she's sophisticated with it.
Yeah, and I get 2 guineas extra a time.
Do you? Do you know, I've always been told I'd make an extremely good model.
Yeah, for the Chamber of Horrors.
That's a regular occurrence, but always something goes wrong. Like I say, it's very repetitive, very formulaic.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the writers now, since we're insulting them by saying their comedy's repetitive. Tell me a little bit about Ronald Chesney and Ronald Wolfe. We're treating them as a couple, right? They work together.
Yeah, certainly they're more famous things. For me, Chesney and Wolfe are on the buses. That's kind of what I think of immediately, and that certainly was their biggest hit. But the Rag Trade was their big hit before that, as in the one that made their names on TV, and they did On the Buses off the back of that. When I actually looked these guys up, I didn't really know that much about them, to be honest with you. But Ronald Chesney is very interesting. He's of French descent. His real name is René Lucien Cadière. He went to the French Lycée in London, where we talked about where Francis de la Tour went to.
Oh, yes,
I believe it's the same school. And then his early career was as a professional harmonica player.
Get away.
I don't know how much call there was for harmonica players, but he was like like if you wanted a harmonica player in the 40s and 50s, you go straight to Ronald Chesney. I mean, that was the name on everyone's lips. And one of the jobs he got as a harmonica player was doing musical interludes for the radio show Educating Archie.
Educating Archie was radio ventriloquy, right?
Yes, that's correct, yeah. And of course, it was where Tony Hancock met Galton Simpson, because they were writing for it, and he had a bit part on that. So Ronald Wolfe, the other Ronald here, he was already writing on Educating Archie. So when Ronald Chesney started playing harmonica for the show, they just hooked up and went, shall we write together? And Ronald Chesney put his harmonica down and went, yeah, all right, I can write this with you. And as far as I can tell, that's it. That's the history of how he became a writer.
Harmonica is up there in my head with bagpipes and accordion, and that I can see there's a lot of skill involved, but honestly, I don't want to hear it.
But yeah, so Ronald Wolfe was just a bit more of a standard writer journey. He was writing for music hall comedians, specifically in the kind of the Jewish comedy work. He was of Jewish stock himself. He's apparently a cousin of Warren Mitchell. Apparently, that's according to Wikipedia. I'm sure it's true.
Citation needed.
And so they wrote for Educating Archie together quite a lot. They wrote the last few series of that with Marty Feldman. Lots of other radio stuff. But the Rag Trade was their big sort of get on the TV. Yeah, so they went on to write lots of things. So Meet the Wife with Thora Hird. The Bedsit Girl, they wrote for Sheila Hancock. They did On the Buses, of course. Don't Drink the Water, which was a spin-off from On the Buses.
That was On the Buses on Holiday, right?
No, that's Blakey and his sister go and live in Spain.
Yeah, On the Buses on Holiday. What do you want from me?
And then they did Romany Jones. They did and then Yes, My Dear.
Hang on, Romany Jones sounds a bit problematic. What?
No, it's fine. I don't even think about it. And then they were tailing off by the 70s. They did this revival of the rag trade, which didn't particularly do anything special. They did a sitcom in 1980 called Watch This Space with Peter Blake, who, as you know, is my talisman now. He's my spirit sitcom animal. And one of the very last series they did was Take a Letter, Mr. Jones, with John Inman. A hilarious gender reversal of a male secretary. But it was the 80s by then, and I think their style had just kind of fallen out of favour. And I mean, the Young Ones was, 2 years after that? I mean, come on. And, bear in mind, they were in their 60s by that point as well. But they both lived very long lives. Ronald Chesney died in 2018. He was well into his 90s by that point. Well, that's all the rag trade we have for you this week, but come back next time where we will look at the other actors and also look in a little bit more detail at the 1976 remake by LWT. In the meantime, do go and check out our other content, and of course you can follow us on the social medias at BritscomPod. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you will be back next week.